The African slave trade has existed for centuries. The African slave trade inside Africa itself was common in Ghana and Nigeria in the 18th century, where the country's economies depended largely on the selling of hand labor to neighboring estates. Slavery inside Africa was often not for life. Slaves had the option of buying their liberty and were normally paid enough that they could do it after a certain number of years. In the rest of the world, the African slave trade became common in Europe first, starting with Portugal, who took slaves to Brazil to mine the mountains. The Caribbean soon followed, and then other countries of South and Central America. After kidnapping potential slaves, merchants forced them to walk in slave caravans. Caravans? That's not a word. That's silly. I'm gonna wait till 15 seconds and just keep going. You guys be quiet. Here goes. After kidnapping potential slaves, merchants forced them to walk in slave caravans to European coastal ports, sometimes as far as 1,000 miles. Shackled and underfed, only half the people survived these death marches. Those too sick or too weary to keep up were often killed or left to die. Those who reached the coastal ports were put into underground dungeons, where they would stay as long as a year, until they boarded the ships. The Middle Passage was the transport of slaves across the Atlantic. On the first leg of their trip, slave traders delivered goods from European ports to West African ones. On the middle leg, such captains as John Newton, who later became an enemy of slave trade, loaded their empty holds with slaves and transported them to the Americas and the Caribbean. A typical Atlantic crossing took up to 60 or 90 days, but some lasted up to 4 months. When they arrived, captains sold the slaves and purchased raw materials to be brought back to Europe on the last leg of the trip. Africans were often treated like cattle during the crossing. On the slave ships, people were stuffed between decks into spaces too low for standing. The heat was often unbearable, and the air was nearly unbreathable. Women were often used sexually. Men were often chained in pairs, shackled wrist to wrist or ankle to ankle. People were crowded together, usually forced to lie on their backs with their heads between the legs of others. This meant that they often had to lie in each other's feces, urine, and in case of dysentery, even blood. In such cramped quarters, diseases such as smallpox and yellow fever spread. The diseased were sometimes thrown overboard to prevent wholesale epidemics. Because a small crew had to control so many, cruel measures such as iron muzzles and whippings were used to control.
The Slave Trade Act was an act of Parliament of the United Kingdom passed on March 25, 1807. The original act is in the Parliamentary Archives. The act abolished the slave trade in British Empire, but not slavery itself. Slavery on English soil was unsupported in English law, and that position was confirmed in Somerset's case in 1772, but it remained legal in most of British Empire until the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833. The Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, formed in 1787, was formed by a group of evangelical English Protestants allied with Quakers to unite in their shared opposition to slavery and the slave trade. The Quakers had long viewed slavery as immoral, and by 1807 the abolitionist groups had a very sizable faction of like-minded members in the British Parliament. At the height, they controlled 35 to 40 seats, known as the Saints. The alliance was led by William Wilberforce, and most well known of the anti-slave trade campaigners who had taken the cause of the abolition in 1787 after having read the evidence of Thomas Clarkson had amazed against the trade. These parliamentarians had acted
Enforcement of the Slave Trade Act. The Royal Navy then controlled the world seas and established the West Africa Squadron in 1808 in order to patrol the coast of West Africa. Between the years 1808 and 1860, they seized approximately 1,600 slave ships and freed 150,000 Africans who were aboard. The Royal Navy declared that the ships transporting slaves were equivalent to pirates. Also, action was taken against African leaders who refused to agree with British treaties to outlaw the trade. Anti-slavery treaties were signed by over 50 African rulers. In the 1860s, David Livingstone's reports of atrocities within the Arab slave trade in Africa stirred up the interest of British public, reviving the flagging abolitionist movement.